Yes.
Yep, you're on camera. I'm on camera. We can start. Yes, sorry. Did someone say something? Okay. Today, what I want to look at is the issue of class and conflict. Now, as you understand, Rojas is really, in many ways the spine of this program is MA Muslim cultures, because the unique feature of the MA Muslim cultures is the application of the social sciences and humanities, the tools of social sciences and humanities, and analysis and the study of Muslim cultures. Okay, so this is quite different from a study of religious texts. And even if we do study religious texts, for example, we contextualize the study of religious texts because nothing happens in a vacuum. There is always a wider context uh, behind why things happen, behind how ideas emerge. Okay, so for this session, really, we want to look at the analysis of uh, class and conflict, looking at Marx's analysis of class and conflict uh, as a way to try to explain why conflict occurs in societies, and specifically to try to explain uh, the drivers behind capitalism and why capitalism itself generates such antagonism between different social strata. Um, what I want us to try to do is see if we can distinguish between Marxist method, the method of Marx, how he approaches the study of society, and Marxist dogma. So often when we talk about Marx, people think communism, they think the former Soviet Union, they think repression, or they think Stalin. Okay, so we want to try to separate those two things. It's a similar way of approaching the study of, say, Muslims and Islam and saying, well, actually, is Islam about what ISIS are doing, or is Islam about what's being taught in the Quran, for example? Okay. Um, okay. So just very quickly, did that work? Great. Let's leave to this. Just a quick session outline. So I want to start off with just the session aims and objectives and learning outcomes. Want to look quickly at who Marx was, what his method was, what his key concepts and theories are, and of course the critical question: why Marx? Is he relevant in the study of Muslim cultures? What I forgot to add in here is of course, um, this will be the first session where you have to hand in an assignment for. If you remember, Philip Wood talked about in the first session. There's 5 uh, theorists you need to reflect on. Okay, and I'll come to that later at the end of the today's session. We may not go. I prefer not to go the full. How much have we got? 3 hours, is it? 25. Yeah. So we won't do the full 3 hours. Hopefully we can finish it in 2 hours, but let's see how quickly we can get through some stuff. Okay. And I prefer not to. I prefer not to lecture as such because um, if I'm going to read you lecture notes, you can read it yourself. Okay. So there'll be a bit elements of lecturing, but in general, we'll try to work through some ideas together. Okay, I think I got the hang of this now. Are we there? Okay, so the main aim is really to study Marx's method and theories relevant to the study of modernity. Okay. Marx is a modern theorist. We want to examine the development process as a product of particular historical and social struggles. Analyze capitalism as a set of social relations, yeah, and not just an economic system. So social relations, and in terms of its laws of motion. By laws of motion, we mean the sort of inner workings, the internal dynamic of capitalism. What is it that drives capitalism forward? And then we want to discuss Marx's method and relevance of this today for the study of Muslim cultures. Okay. Is he relevant or is he not relevant? It's up to us to decide that. Okay, so at the end of today's session, you should be able to appreciate Marx's analysis of how social structures and social relations shape history. Understand the role of class struggle in the emergence of capitalism. And recognize the internal dynamic of capitalism and its social and economic implications. This is quite important because often we have the whole debate about one of the big debates arising from this third point is, can capitalism be reformed? Can we make capitalist bosses of factories in Bangladesh where the factories keep collapsing and killing workers, can we make them behave in a more responsible way, for example? So this is the arguments that there are ways we can make capitalism better for everyone. And there's also Marx's argument, for example, that, well, actually, these bosses themselves are not necessarily evil. They're just doing what they need to do, keep costs down, to sell their textiles cheaper than the next factory. And one way to keep costs down is to lock the workers in the building when they start working, so they don't have little breaks here and there, and keep the construction of the building itself cheap. Okay, so obviously then there's issue of regulation, etc. Okay, let's start with a quick. Is that fairly clear?
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with a quick quiz. Who was Marx? A, philosopher. B, historian. C, sociologist. D, economist.
Sociologist.
C, Who thinks he's a sociologist? Only one. Two.
I think he was a sociologist, economist, and like philosopher.
Well,
Maybe all
that's
of them.
yeah. He is. Sorry, wrong button. All of the above. Okay. So you can approach Marx from a variety of ways. As a philosopher, as a historian. So the key reading I gave you for today's session, Capital Volume 1, so it's large tracts of history, his observations. And you know, Marx is highly contentious, but not many people question his description of, say, the Industrial Revolution in England in the 17th, 18th century. Okay, now what I wanted to do before we start, by the way, are you all on Moodle now?
Yep.
So did you manage to log on and check
The
Moodle for
readings?
this session?
Yes.
So you looked at the readings and everything and the links. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so what I want us to do now is, have you got enough pairs? 2 pairs and 1 group of 3 perhaps. Tell me, discuss amongst yourself first, what you think Marxism is, and why or why not it's relevant to the discussion of Muslims of Muslim cultures. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But surely he's also a communist
Yeah.
Also a socialist.
and a socialist. So this is another trick question, obviously. So why was Marx an idealist? Because he believed that ideas explain human behavior. So, and this ties very closely to a German philosopher who influenced Marx early on called Hegel. Okay, although Marx subsequently departed from Hegel and critiqued Hegel quite strongly. He's a humanist because he's concerned about the human condition. He's concerned about human emancipation, freedom, from the condition brought about by capitalism in particular, namely, haven't done this. Namely, the problem of alienation. Okay, that humans under capitalism are alienated, and we'll come to that a bit later. Okay, he's a materialist in the sense that he believes, unlike Hegel, he believes that material conditions, the conditions we live under, explain the sort of ideas we have. Okay, so ideas don't emerge in a vacuum. Whereas a lot of philosophers, Hegel included, think that ideas shape human behavior. He's a socialist because he believes in communal public ownership, and he's a communist because his utopia is a classless society.
Yeah.
Where there's no one on top and no one at the bottom. Everyone's equal. Okay, so that's utopian idealistic. But of course, the question we then have to ask is, which Marx? So the first 3 ideas here, idealist, humanist, materialist, is very much associated with the young Marx. Okay. And the second 2 are more closely associated with the mature, we call it mature Marx. There's no clean break, obviously there's continuity of sorts. Okay. Okay, I want to quickly have a look at
Sorry to interrupt. The Capitalist book was written at a later age when he was old, right?
Capital was written when he was mature Marx.
And the communist slogan one.
Communist Manifesto was written a bit earlier. He wrote 3 volumes of Capital. He didn't finish the third volume. The third volume was pretty much incomplete. I think his good friend Engels had to help him finish it. Or finish it after he died. Okay, I want us to look at. I tried this before and it works. I thought it might be useful rather than me bore you.
Most people agree that we need to improve our economic system somehow. Yet we're also often keen to dismiss the ideas of capitalism's most famous and ambitious critic, Karl Marx. This isn't very surprising. In practice, his political and economic ideas have been used to design disastrously planned economies and nasty dictatorships. Nevertheless, we shouldn't reject Marx too quickly. We ought to see him as a guide whose diagnosis of capitalism's ills helps us to navigate towards a more promising future. Capitalism is going to have to be reformed, and Marx's analyses are going to be part of any answer. Marx was born in 1818 in Trier in Germany. Soon he became involved with the Communist Party, a tiny group of intellectuals advocating for the overthrow of the class system and the abolition of private property. He worked as a journalist and had to flee Germany, eventually settling in London. Marx wrote an enormous number of books and articles, sometimes with his friend Friedrich Engels. Mostly, Marx wrote about capitalism, the type of economy that dominates the Western world. It was, in his day, still getting going, and Marx was one of its most intelligent and perceptive critics. These were some of the problems he identified with it. Modern work is alienated. One of Marx's greatest insights is that work can be one of the sources of our greatest joys. But in order to be fulfilled at work, Marx wrote that workers need to see themselves in the objects they have created. Think of the person who built this chair. It's straightforward, strong, honest, and elegant. It's an example of how, at its best, labour offers us a chance to externalise what's good inside us. But this is increasingly rare in the modern world. Part of the problem is that modern work is incredibly specialised. Specialised jobs make the modern economy highly efficient, but they also mean that it's seldom possible for any one worker to derive a sense of the genuine contribution they might be making to the real needs of humanity. Marx argued that modern work leads to alienation, Entfremdung. In other words, a feeling of disconnection between what you do all day and who you feel you really are and what you think you'd ideally be able to contribute to existence. Modern work is insecure. Capitalism makes the human being utterly expendable, just one factor among others in the forces of production, and one that can ruthlessly be let go the minute that costs rise or savings can be made through technology. And yet, as Marx knew deep inside each of us, we don't want to be arbitrarily let go. We're terrified of being abandoned. Communism isn't just an economic theory. Understood emotionally, it expresses a deep-seated longing that we always have a place in the world's heart, that we will not be cast out. Workers get paid little, while capitalists get rich. This is perhaps the most obvious qualm that Marx had with capitalism. In particular, he believed that capitalists shrink the wages of the labourers as much as possible in order to skim off a wide profit margin. He called this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. Whereas capitalists see profit as a reward for ingenuity and technological talent, Marx was far more damning. Profit is simply theft, and what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce. However much one dresses up the fundamentals, Marx insists that at its crudest, capitalism means paying a worker one price for doing something and then selling it to somebody else at a much higher price. Profit is the fancy term for exploitation. Capitalism is very unstable. Marx proposed that capitalist systems are characterized by a series of crises. Every crisis is dressed up by capitalists as being somehow freakish and rare and soon to be the last one. Far from it, argued Marx. Crises are endemic to capitalism, and they're caused by something rather odd. The fact that we're able to produce too much, far more than anyone needs to consume. Capitalist crises are crises of abundance, rather than, as in the past, crises of shortage. Our factories and systems are so efficient we could give everyone on this planet a car, a house, access to a decent school and a hospital. And that's what so enraged Marx, but also made him so hopeful too. Few of us actually need to work because the modern economy is so productive. But rather than seeing this need not to work as the freedom it is, we complain about it masochistically and describe it by a pejorative word, unemployment. We should call it freedom. There's so much unemployment for a good and deeply admirable reason, because we're so good at making things efficiently. We're not all needed at the coalface. But in that case, we should, thought Marx, make leisure admirable. We should redistribute the wealth of the massive corporations that make so much surplus money and give it to everyone. This is in its own way as beautiful a dream as Jesus' promise of heaven, but a good deal more realistic sounding. Capitalism is bad for capitalists. Marx didn't think that capitalists were evil. For example, he was acutely aware of the sorrows and secret agonies that lay behind bourgeois marriage. Marx argued that marriage was actually an extension of business, and that the bourgeois family was fraught with tension, oppression and resentment, with people staying together not for love, but for financial reasons. Marx believed that the capitalist system forces everyone to put economic interests at the heart of their lives, so that they can no longer know deep, honest relationships. He called this psychological tendency commodity fetishism, Warenfetischismus, because it makes us value things that have no objective value. He wanted people to be freed from financial constraint so that they could at last start to make sensible, healthy choices in their relationships. The 20th century feminist answer to the oppression of women has been to argue that women should simply be able to go out to work, but Marx's answer was more subtle. This feminist insistence merely perpetuates human slavery. The point isn't that women should imitate the sufferings of their male colleagues, it's that men and women should have the permanent option to enjoy leisure. Why don't we all think a bit more like Marx? An important aspect of Marx's work is that he proposes that there's an insidious, subtle way in which the economic system colours the sort of ideas that we end up having. The economy generates what Marx termed an ideology. A capitalist society is one where most people, rich and poor, believe all sorts of things that are really just value judgments that relate back to the economic system. For example, that a person who doesn't work is worthless, that leisure beyond a few weeks a year is sinful, that more belongings will make us happier, and that worthwhile things and people will invariably make money. In short, one of the biggest evils of capitalism is not that there are corrupt people at the top. This is true in any human hierarchy. But that capitalist ideas teach all of us to be anxious, competitive, conformist, and politically complacent. Marx didn't only outline what was wrong with capitalism. We also get glimpses of what Marx wanted the ideal utopian future to be like. In his Communist Manifesto, he describes a world without private property or inherited wealth, with a steeply graduated income tax, centralized control of the banking, communication and transport industries, and free public education. Marx also expected that communist society would allow people to develop lots of different sides of their natures. In communist society, it's possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman or critic. After Marx moved to London, he was supported by his friend and intellectual partner Friedrich Engels, a wealthy man whose father owned a cotton plant in Manchester. Engels covered Marx's debts and made sure his works were published. Capitalism paid for communism. The two men even wrote each other adoring poetry. Marx was not a well-regarded or popular intellectual in his day. Respectable, conventional people of Marx's day would have laughed at the idea that his ideas could remake the world. Yet just a few decades later they did. His writings became the keystone for some of the most important ideological movements of the 20th century. But Marx was like a brilliant doctor in the early days of medicine. He could recognize the nature of the disease, although he had no idea how to go about curing it. At this point in history, we should all be Marxists, in the sense of agreeing with his diagnosis of our troubles. But we need to go out and find the cures that really will work. as Marx himself declared, and we deeply agree, philosophers until now have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
Okay, let me quickly run through a few slides, which you may have already seen if you scroll down. So basically, this is the question: is Marxism a social theory, historical analysis of class and capitalism, an economic critique of capitalism, political ideology, economic determinism?
What do you mean by economic determinism?
Economic determinism is the belief that history unfolds in a certain way, that Marx has identified the laws of motion of history and it unfolds in a certain way, and capitalism will eventually give way to socialism and subsequently communism. So just as capitalism replaced feudalism, because feudalism's time had come, capitalism's time will come. Mind you, capitalism is only a couple of hundred years old. Capitalism is still very young in the history of humanity, very, very young. So to actually assume that capitalism will be here to stay is questionable, because we don't know. But Marx is saying, and some of his writings is saying that these will happen. So, and of course, then it opens up accusations of that, well, he's being deterministic. He's saying that it's inevitable that this will happen. And which is why, if you remember with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Francis Fukuyama said that he declared the end of history. If you remember that, in 1990. Okay, because that was the end of history. Capitalism had won, and capitalism will remain. Okay. Okay, so what do we think Marxism is here?
All of this.
It is. It is all of the above. Okay. It is a social theory because it's concerned about social relations, unequal social relations in particular. It's a historical analysis of capitalism and the emergence of different social classes. It's a, as we've seen in the clip, it's a critique of capitalism. It is also an ideology of sorts. Yeah, it believes that capitalism is not right. We talked about determinism already. Okay, so let's quickly look. I want to quickly look at, just to clarify, some of Marx's ethic. This is what drives, what informs his ideas in many ways. Okay. His first question really is the question of what's so special about humans? What is it that makes us distinct from animals? And as you've seen in that little clip there, the YouTube clip, what was that again?
They show the example of a chair that it reflects the creativity of the creator.
It's production, that we engage, we make things and we use our labor to create things. Okay, a productive system. So for Marx, a productive system that degrades labor, that reduces labor to just work, as opposed to creating objects which humans can relate to and which we can be proud of, and which also reflect ourselves some way, embody. You know, if you carve something, that's embodiment of you in many ways. If you make something as well, okay. But for capitalism, it becomes work. Okay, you're disconnected. Part of this is also the factory system, where previously you might make an entire chair, but today you might just be screwing on a leg, and then the next person down the line maybe stitches on the cushion or something. Okay.
But before you used to make chair only for yourself or maybe
That's
your
right.
immediate family members.
That's right.
Now you are doing it for living, to earn money.
Mm-hmm.
So the time has changed. And even in previous time, for example, if someone was making the chair, that doesn't guarantee that the same person was going to the forest and cutting the wood and then bringing that wood to the city or wherever he used to live and then carving it. Maybe he was just doing the final part of carving. The person who was cutting the tree, maybe he did not have any sense of connection with the chair. So you can say that even today,
Maybe.
the person who is just screwing the leg,
Mm-hmm.
maybe he doesn't have the connection.
Well, yeah, he doesn't. Well, for Marx, definitely, this is a system which deforms humanity, really.
Yeah.
So for Marx, the recovery of human creativity Remember, he's concerned about human emancipation. The recovery of human creativity requires we reconstruct the whole productive system, because a productive system is what capitalism is. It's an economic system as well as a political system. So it's a economic system that compels people to do certain types of work. And for Marx, the fundamental contradiction of capitalist society is what I talked about: the private control of social production. Basically, the private ownership of the means of production. Okay, so workers cannot necessarily take control because they don't own the factories. They have no say. They have no choice but to work for the capitalists. So the logical conclusion of this is really the abolition of private property for Marx. And remember that private property, when Marx talks about private property in this context, he's talking about the means of production, social sort of goods. He's not talking about your iPhone or your laptop or even your
Because
house
he's also
or your
talking
car.
about that you have to build your house in a manner that it frees enough space for farming. If someone else is interested in the 4 acre land area that he's talking about that was prevalent in the 17th century, he criticizes that the people used to make bigger houses and now you don't even get any free land. So he does talk about not iPhone in particular, but your private.
Yes, but that's a different that relates to that relates to the problem of the reason why why the proletariat is a working class,
Yeah.
why workers are forced to work, is because what alternative do they have? What were they before they were workers? They were usually peasants, and they lived off the land. Usually had an arrangement, even if they didn't own the land, it may have been owned by the feudal lord. They had some arrangement that they could farm on the land. They had to give the feudal lord a portion of their produce, of what they harvested, but they got to keep something. Okay? And they don't have to work. They can work if they want to, but if they're not happy with the work in the factory to earn extra money, they just go back to planting more food for themselves. But Marx is arguing that actually under capitalism they no longer have a choice, because part of the process of capitalism is the removal of the separation of peasants from their land and the transformation of the peasant class, the peasantry, into workers, into landless laborers, essentially. Okay. Okay, so of course there's a context to everything, as for all ideas I've mentioned about. Okay, and the context for Marx here is really the structural and social transformation in Europe, specifically the Industrial Revolution and the numerous political revolutions that were occurring across Europe. Now, this was a period of tremendous change, economically, socially, politically, in terms of religion and philosophy as well. Okay, so what do we have? We had, for example, in 1848, there was a violent revolution in France. That was in February. In March, Vienna was on fire. Later on, Buda and Pest in Hungary were on fire, and the revolution was spreading. Okay, and then of course there were counter-revolutionary forces. So that was the overall context of what was happening. In particular, the social transformations involved the shift from largely rural agrarian societies into urban industrial societies. Okay, a transformation from feudal to capitalist, a transformation from communal to individualist societies. Okay, that was the broader economic context. The intellectual context related to Marx, obviously, is everyone's influence. No one creates ideas in a vacuum. All great ideas are built on the shoulders of previous thinkers. Okay, so in this case, Marx was influenced heavily by English political economists, namely Adam Smith and David Ricardo. In the past, there were no such things as economists. They were all political economists. They didn't study economics separate from politics. It was all together. He was influenced by, I mentioned already, by the philosophy, the idealist philosophy of Hegel in his early years, and also by the ideas of French socialism. Remember, Marx became a communist at a very young age. Okay? These were utopian socialists. They were hoping for ideal socialist utopia where there was equality, But for Marx, these people didn't really have the analysis of what was wrong with capitalism in the first place. And the key question here for Marx and his contemporaries, Durkheim, Weber, was really to how do you explain what's happening in society in Western Europe at that period? How do we explain all the changes that are taking place on so many levels? Changes in thinking, changes in social structures, changes in political systems, changes in economic systems. Okay, and underline that, what are the conditions, obviously, as a humanist, Marx was what are the conditions necessary for human progress? Because he was documenting the emergence of capitalism, especially in England, and he could see that it created a lot of misery and suffering. Okay, Marx's method. So his aim is basically to examine the conditions of human progress. Okay, progress here is really in terms of human struggle with nature. So human existence really is how we can survive in the world, how we deal with nature, how we grow food, how we clothe ourselves, how we build houses, etc. Okay, how we have we can deal with extreme weather events. So material conditions are key to human progress, and for Marx, it's really the foundations for human progress. I'll come back to that in a bit. Now, in sociology, sociology typically studies ideas, beliefs, values that motivate people, aside from the economy. Okay, so sociology looks at what drives society. Okay, why do people behave in certain ways? But for Marx, the economy drives our actions. Okay, and so productive activity, because the economy drives our actions, productive activity is really the central concern for social life. We need to produce to have a social life. We cannot have a social life without producing. Everything for Marx centers on production. Whether we are growing something to feed ourselves and our children, whether we're making something to satisfy our human needs. Okay, so the focus for Marx, therefore, is on the economy. I already mentioned that social life cannot be sustained unless production is organized. So we can't talk about society, we can't talk about social relations, we can't talk about culture in any meaningful way if we can't feed ourselves. Okay, so I need to emphasize that the production here for Marx is key. Production, in turn, when we produce things, we enter into relationships. So, for example, the example of the woodcutter and the chair maker. So the chair maker may not actually be chopping the wood, and even in pre-capitalist times, this is most certainly the case. They'll get the wood from the woodcutter, but then there is a relationship there already between the carpenter sourcing the wood and the woodcutter giving the wood to the carpenter.
Sorry, I wanted to ask regarding the first point.
Mm-hmm.
On one side, Marx is saying that ideally a person should do something in the morning that he wants to do,
Mm-hmm.
other things that he
Mm-hmm.
wants to do. And here the focus is on the fact that social life cannot be sustained unless production is
Mm-hmm.
organized.
Mm-hmm.
So how can something be organized if a person is ideally
that was raised earlier as well. Did you raise it before? Yes. I think it's a very important point. I think what Marx is saying is not that people should do different things.
They should be allowed to.
They should be allowed to. If they want to, if I want to fish today and then I want to rear my cattle late in the afternoon and read some books later, I should be allowed to. Now the question then is, who's going to look after production?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that production necessarily is abandoned, but I think the starting point for Marx here is that, remember, capitalism is such an efficient economic system. And for Marx, capitalism is really essential. He welcomed it as a replacement of feudalism because the internal logic, the dynamic of capitalism drives capitalists to become more and more efficient. Otherwise, someone else will take your business and you go bankrupt. Okay, and because we're so efficient at producing things now, we're producing more things than we actually need. Okay, so we actually don't need to produce that much. But the fact is that capitalism as a system can run on its own. in many ways. Yeah, of course, we still have managers of factories to make sure that production continues, and just as we have timetables. So if two of you decide you want to go fishing or to play football later this afternoon, we just need to make sure that two other people are in the factory doing what needs to be done.
Exactly the point. Just to give two of us the option that we can go fishing, you took away that option from other two people, maybe who also wanted to go
Yeah,
do
well,
something else.
Yeah, well, not necessarily. People shouldn't be compelled, obviously.
Yeah.
But I guess we're getting, we perhaps getting ahead of ourselves here. Marx has a famous saying, each to their, do you know this saying?
Yeah.
Each to their own need. So people contribute each to their own ability and to their own need. So each people contribute what they can, and they take what they need, and no more.
Exactly. The main point of argument is this. For example, if your output in numerical term, if I may say, is 7, and my output is 3,
Mm-hmm.
and if my demand is 5 and your demand is 7,
Mm-hmm.
then there's a difference in output and demand.
Mm-hmm. So
I'm expecting more.
Well,
demand
obviously,
to
yeah, obviously, I don't know what the answer would that necessarily, what the answer might necessarily be to that. But the issue, of course, is society is full of differences.
Yeah.
But Marx wants to remove the biggest source of inequality to begin with, and then we can decide what's fair within society. That we all obviously have the opportunity to do what to fulfill our full potential. Okay, shall I move on?
Yeah.
So the focus on the economy, I mentioned that production entails focus is on production, and production entails patterns of exchange and relationships. This was the anti-Hegelian thing. Hegel argues that consciousness determines life. So if you're aware of something, that's how you perceive life to be. But for Marx, actually, life determines consciousness. And he does this by distinguishing between the base and the superstructure.
Can you elaborate a bit more?
On the base and superstructure?
The third point.
The
Life determines the consciousness.
Yes, so the conditions of the material conditions I mentioned earlier. So the conditions of our life, whether we are oppressed or not, determines how we think.
Yeah.
Okay, so for Marx, he distinguishes between what is known as the economic base, production, it's fairly clear, and the social superstructure, which includes things such as religion, culture, the media. So here's an illustration of that. The base is all things needed to be produced: machines, factories, land, raw materials, people's relations to production here. And the superstructure is really everything not to do with production. It includes education, family, religion, politics, media. Now, what Marx argues is that this base shapes the superstructure. So, religion, our ideas, our family relationships, politics, media is shaped by this. Okay, and this in turn legitimizes the base. Remember the clip just now? They talked about ideology about. Remember the bit with the tower with the radio waves?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he talks about when he talks about hegemony of ideas. So capitalist ideas are prevalent, and this is why we think if you pick up a newspaper or read the news, whenever there's a strike, whether it's a teacher strike, a doctor strike, whatever, or railway strike, you'll never find a single media report in favor of the strike. Why? People who strike are basically villainized. They're seen as villains, they're seen as creating huge inconvenience for the general public.
Yeah.
But in reality, they are also the general public. And the strike is a legal right of all trade unions. So you'll see every government here, whether it's Labour or the Tories, well, new Labour anyway, not the current Labour opposition, they'll always say that, well, actually, you should negotiate, you shouldn't strike, because strikes are bad. But actually, they fail to even admit that strikes are legal, and it's a human right to go on strike. Okay, but the way that we have been conditioned is basically that anything that inconveniences everyone is. So rather than blaming uh, the government for not paying nurses enough, or doctors enough, or teachers enough, we blame the teachers and nurses for going on strike. Okay.
So, what is the alternative? There should be another way which is less convenient for others, inconvenient for others. For example, if
For
teachers suddenly go on
internal
strike,
strike? Well, the current strike right now, the planned strike right now is between RMT, which is the railway uh, union, and one of the private railway operators. Okay, over working conditions, etc. So through the media, you hear one side of the story primarily. Okay, but interestingly, when you interview passengers who are affected, most of them actually support the union. They feel that these are important issues, and it's basically the train operating company in this case not wanting to cut costs, wanting to reduce the number of drivers or staff on the train on stations. So, but the solution is really a negotiation. The current doctors, there's been this ongoing junior doctor strike. Okay, but the government doesn't want to negotiate with the junior doctors. But it's very hard. Often it's very, very hard to find out what's going on, what the real alternative is, because we often get a very biased view of these sort of industrial actions. But that's just one example of how the media seeks to legitimize the conditions for capitalist production. Okay, let's have a break. Come back at 1:15. 10 minutes.
okay,
Is that all right? We can have it shorter if you want.
no, it's okay.
Nine. Okay, I want to run through a couple of slides quite quickly. There's no point me reading them to you because you can read them yourselves. You have them. You already have them. Okay. We know that Marx based as part of Marx's method, he chose England as his case study. Okay, so a lot of the laws of motion of capitalism, which he identified, and the relationships of production, etc., is based on his very in-depth study of England. So the question is, why England? For Marx, it was obvious because England had capitalism at its purest and at its most developed, its most mature. Okay, so he focused on primarily England as the locus of capitalist mode of production. I talked about to uncover these laws of motion, and also London is the best place to observe bourgeois society. Okay, bourgeois being capitalist society, right. And he also chose England because it allowed him to focus on some of the major works by in political economy by people such as in England and Scotland, such as Adam Smith. You know Adam Smith, classical economist. David Ricardo I mentioned earlier. Thomas Malthus, heard of him? Malthusian theory. What was his most famous Malthusian? The Malthusian theory is famous for saying that population growth will eventually outstrip production of food, and people will starve. Okay, but he didn't account for the huge efficiency of capitalism to produce more than enough food for everyone. Okay, and John Stuart Mill, a philosopher. At the heart of Marx's analysis of capitalism is this idea of, and history is this idea of historical materialism. Okay, it's basically a materialist conception of history that people make history. So in a sense, when we talk about economic determinism, sometimes Marx is accused of being an economic determinist. Actually, he argues that it's the social forces which bring about historical change. Okay, uh, and it's grounded in the idea that people make their own lives in their productive capacity and productive activity. So historical change is not rooted or characterized by development of ideas, as argued by Hegel. And I don't want to talk about Hegel too much because shall we do that?
Yeah,
Let's
please.
jump a couple of slides here. Let's see how I do this. So to answer this question, we need to go to slide. That one there. This idea of primitive accumulation. Now you may remember it was mentioned in the document, that little video, and that was actually technically an incorrect definition of primitive accumulation. Okay, accumulation is a process of accumulating wealth, basically making money and using the money to make more money. So the capitalist accumulates wealth by making profit by paying the workers less than what they can sell the product for, using that money to reinvest in the factory or whatever, okay, to make production more efficient. That's the idea of accumulation. Okay, so it's about profit.
But
The
then
question,
this is referring to the point where the capitalism started.
yes, the question
Okay.
Marx is asking
But
is,
then this means that the class system only exists since the start of capitalism, which is not true.
what do you mean?
By this definition,
Mhm.
that some people who were born capitalists and some people who were born laborers,
Mhm.
it was pointing to the point where the capitalist system started, right?
He is saying some people are not born capitalists and some people are not born
Yeah, I
laborers.
agree.
Marx
But
says you
this
can't say
classist
that.
difference has
Okay.
always been there.
The class system's always been there, but not a class system based on this. Okay, so let's have a look. Primitive. So Marx wants to find out. Yes, we got capitalists who are accumulating, but the question is, where did the original accumulation start from? Where did they get the money in the first place to set up the factory or start a farm? Where does that money come from? So for Marx, really, primitive accumulation is really the previous accumulation before the capitalist accumulation occurs. Okay, it's not the result of capitalist mode of production, but it's the starting point. Okay, and this, for him, primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin plays in theology. Okay, so it says, in times long gone by, there were two sorts of people: one, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite; the other, lazy rascals spending their substance and more in riotous living, drinking, partying, not working, just enjoying life. And that's why you have people who are rich and successful and people who are poor. This is the myth for Marx. Okay? Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth and the latter sort had nothing to sell except their own skins. This is in Capital Volume 1. So in actual history, it is notorious that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly force played a great part. Okay? And here we have part of it involves what knows as the Enclosures Act. So what happens in Parliament in England in the 17th century is that as more and more capitalists emerge and become MPs, become parliamentarians. Remember, you had to own property to be a member of Parliament. Okay.
I want to
They-
ask one question, if it's okay.
Yeah.
So in Islamic history, we read about the fact that there were people who used to charge interest,
Mhm.
exorbitant interest from the people, and
Mhm.
Muhammad prohibited that practice towards the end of his life.
Mhm.
He declared that Muslims shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
So if people were charging exorbitant profits, they were making money out of money,
Mhm.
which is the thing that is relevant to capitalism.
Mhm.
So, if capitalism existed in the Arab society 1,000 years before it was present in Europe, so my point is like, how can we say that the original sin started
No,
in
but
the
but
14th
but
century? Or
but for Marx, capitalism is not just about interest. The distinguishing features of capitalism.
it wasn't only about charging interest. There was a particular group that was involved
Benefiting.
in that business,
Yeah.
and that was making a lot of money out of it. And they were just like sitting, doing
Mhm.
nothing. This is
Mhm.
again the capitalist
Mhm.
elite thing. So they used to sit and they used to charge like 15% or 20%.
Mhm.
So the person who's at the other end keeps on paying the
Mhm.
interest
Mhm.
and is never able to pay the principal. So
Mhm.
it's never gets out of the debt
That,
itself.
yeah.
So if that mechanism, I mean that mechanism is very much related to what capitalism has been doing. There's an elite that sits around
Yeah.
and the labor is working. So
Mhm.
if, why he thinks that the starting point is in the 15th century? Why not in the 6th century or
Exactly, that's my
before?
point is.
Because
For
they
capitalism, because the essence of capitalism for Marx really is the divorcing of labor from the land. So they cannot sustain their livelihoods except by selling their own labor. So labor workers cannot go back and go, this capitalist is too greedy, he's paying me too little, making me work too hard, I'm going to go back and grow some food instead. It's a better life that way. They don't have a choice anymore. So they've been separated. The separation of workers from the land is one component. And the second is the ownership of means of production. But we'll come to it when we talk about capitalism. There's some distinguishing features of capitalism which make it quite unique to this era. And I think it's important not to confuse that with, as I mentioned, trade or making profit or commerce. These have happened throughout the history of humanity. Capitalism is distinct and requires for Marx requires a distinct analysis. But I think that's an important point. Can we come back to that if we have some time later? Okay, so for Marx, capitalism has entailed all these things: social conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, the emergence of primitive accumulation. And the Enclosures Act was when landowners decided in Parliament, because to become a member of Parliament you have to own land. So you and I, we have no land, we cannot run for Parliament. Okay? That was democracy back in the 17th century. They passed the Enclosures Act, which basically closed off common land which peasants lived on and shared. So communal land was privatized, and peasants was run off, and had nowhere to go basically. Okay, so what we have is he talks about people's land is stolen, and he talks about increase of landless laborers, emergence of capital labor relations as a key to emergence of capitalism. Okay, now I need to go back to our original slide, otherwise I might lose track of. Where were we?
23.
23. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this was what Marx was referring to when you talk about this particular era. Okay. So for Marx, actually, you can't blame the poor person for being poor because his ancestors at some point were really lazy and didn't work. And the rich people, the children of capitalists who inherited wealth, inherited factories and land, because their ancestors were hardworking. I mean, if you look at who owns the land today, who is the queen, and who are the lords that own land in England and Scotland. The king traditionally is really the landowner, the baron, who was most successful in raising an army militarily, forming alliances, and defeating all the other landowners. That's what kings are. And that's how you get kingdoms, okay, under feudalism. So there's nothing natural. So Marx is saying there's nothing natural about this. It's a product of a lot of violence, a lot of conflict, a lot of revolutions.
So why do you have to, see it in a very negative sense? Darwin's theory, survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
During that era, the king
Yeah.
thought that my army
Yeah,
is the best.
that's
He
right.
proved it.
That's not no. I
And
mean,
he was the most fittest.
well, Marx is not necessarily placing any value judgment. Personally, he doesn't like
No, he
capitalism.
is not.
Well,
Constantly, we are saying that he is supporting. He's very sympathizing.
well, he's sympathetic to people who are struggling,
Yeah, exactly.
the landless, and you could say yes, survival of the fittest, but then again, if we're concerned about human progress and human emancipation,
No, but it is
which
essential that if we are concerned about the human progress,
Mhm.
those particular people, the poor class, they should adapt with time. If they are not adapting with time, they are not learning the specialized knowledge,
That's
the
true.
specialized skill of technology, then
Mhm.
obviously they will stay poor for the rest of the generation that to come.
What if they've been thrown off the land
See,
and they have to work in a
we are not
sweatshop?
saying that there were instances where injustice happened to them. We totally agree.
Mhm.
But right now, if they are
Mhm.
not learning the new trade, new
Mhm.
skills,
Mhm.
the specialized knowledge that the documentary showed,
Yeah.
then obviously they will never be able to compete with those who have
Yeah.
those.
But that's within the
knowledge.
capitalist system. That's within the terms of the capitalist system.
Yeah.
And Marx is saying the capitalist system actually is not a system for human emancipation. It is a system that benefits. You saw that triangle, yeah, the top 1% really today, and actually the bottom 80% don't gain much. Yeah, we benefit, but it's a trickle. We get the crumbs. Not you and I necessarily. We're somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not at the base of the triangle where people really are living hand to mouth. Okay, but that's a slightly separate discussion. Okay, let's quickly run through. Um, so essentially, that's what Marx is saying there. Okay, so this brings us to his key analysis of capitalism as a mode of production. Okay, remember, production is the thing that makes humans distinct from animals because we actually produce. Animals may scavenge for food, but they don't grow food necessarily. Okay, and what matters is not what we produce, but how we produce it. Okay, so throughout human history, there's been different modes of production, how production has been organized. So under, say, under tribal or really traditional societies, things are really communal. It may be hierarchical, but there's a communal uh, uh, mode of production, you could say. Okay, so there's a sharing and sharing of harvest, etc. Then under slavery, there are slave owners who rely on slaves to do all the work. And slaves obviously are totally unemancipated. They have no rights. Uh, and you know they are owned by slave owners basically. Okay. Then we have feudalism, which we know what it is, and the difference between feudalism and capitalism is that the capitalist, unlike the feudal lord, the feudal lord doesn't have to reinvest money that they make. Why? Because they got more than enough. There's no competition. There's no compulsion for them to actually innovate and produce more and become more efficient. And that, for Marx, is one of the really positive things about capitalism. That it compels capitalists to innovate and to improve, you know, always seeking efficiency. Okay. Now, modes of production are characterized by what I describe as forces of production. That's essentially technology that's used to produce things. So in traditional societies, it's usually the ox and, well, not even that. The most primitive societies are, you might have handheld tools. And as society advances, the forces of production develop. So you have basic tools such as simple irrigation or oxes pulling the plow. Okay. And now today we have much higher technology. And along with the forces of production, we have the relations of production. Relations of production are, in the capitalist system, the relationship between owners of the means of production and workers, laborers, or the proletariat. Okay, and for Marx, there's an evolution in society driven by this increasing division of labor, so increasing specialization. So people increasingly do more and more specialized things, more and more disconnected from the bigger picture. And this brings us to what we looked at, what has been brought up, the idea of alienation, which is key to understanding some of his concerns. That humans can never be fully emancipated, and we cannot realize our full potential as humans as long as we're alienated from the process of production and the final product that we actually make. Um, So we need to look how are humans alienated? For Marx, humans are alienated. These are in your notes, by the way. Humans are alienated in 4 ways. We're alienated from the objects that we make because we don't see it anymore. We need to make part of it. Remember, just the leg or the wheel of the bicycle. Okay. The act of production, the fact that we are compelled to work to produce this in order to survive. Actually, if we had a choice, we wouldn't work.
Exactly.
Everyone would want to live a life of leisure or do their favorite hobby or whatever. Okay. We alienated because from our species being, from ourselves as humans, because if, by Marx's own definition, if humans are distinguished by production, yeah, and now we are separated from production itself, we are alienated from the essence of being human. And finally, we are alienated from our fellow humans. Okay, because labor is just another commodity. So I'm not going to do this one anymore. I think let's just look at this as a group, as a class, rather than break up to discuss it. Okay. So this is a quote from the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, one of Marx's earlier works. He says here, political economy knows the worker only as a working animal, as a beast reduced to the strictest bodily needs. To develop in greater spiritual freedom, a people must break their bondage to their bodily needs. They must cease to be slaves of the body. They must above all have time at their disposal for spiritual, creative activity and spiritual enjoyment. I think this is quite interesting because it's almost the link between Marx and religion.
Yeah.
Spiritual, that's as far as Marx goes to talking about religion. Remember, Marx is also the person who says religion is the opium of the masses. And he's critically saying that, yeah, it is opium because people are so alienated, they have so little hope in society that in their lives that they retreat to personal salvation, and religion offers a salvation. But we won't go there this time. Okay, so what is he saying here in terms of alienation? And why do we need to abolish private property?
By abolishing private property, we can give more opportunities to the lower class to work for themselves and grow something for themselves rather than for someone else.
Exactly.
So
the idea here is basically, rather than being forced to work for someone who owns the means of production, society should decide what we want to produce and how we want to produce it. Well, society may well decide that the capitalist form of production in terms of division of labor, each one doing just one specialized item, is the best way, and that's a reasonable trade-off in terms of having more free time. Or society may decide to reorganize production very, very differently. But the key thing is, society should decide this.
But what do we mean by society?
You and I,
But
everyone,
you and I don't
everyone
have
else.
the same power.
We don't have the same power now. Of course, we have no power right now. We have no power to decide what is produced or how it's produced or who it's produced for.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we have society, for example, currently is overproducing cars. You can see this number of unsold cars in showrooms and in parking lots, etc. But we keep producing these cars. Every year there's a new model. It's fancier, and then if you watch TV, do you watch TV?
Yeah.
Most of the ads seem to be about cars, about selling cars. Then we try to sell this to consumers, and then of course, because the workers themselves who make the cars don't earn enough money to buy the cars, what does capitalism have to innovate in order to make this happen? They offer workers loans, credit. So one of the contradictions of capitalism is, in order to realize more profits for accumulation, we need to reduce costs. And one way to reduce costs is through technology. Another way is to reduce, which displaces labor. Another way is to reduce labor costs by reducing wages or keeping wages low. The problem with that, of course, is workers are also consumers. It doesn't have to be cars, it can be any item, any commodity. And so if workers don't have enough money to buy a car or an iPhone, the latest Samsung Galaxy or whatever, capitalists can't make profit. They can't sell. So this is a bit of a contradiction here.
It's a vicious cycle. You
It's a
cannot
vicious
get
cycle.
out of it.
Yeah. So what one way that capitalism deals with this is by providing cheap and easy credit. Now, of course, at some point the bubble has to burst. You cannot live on credit constantly. And we see with the subprime mortgage, which is the crash of the US housing market in 2008, it's precisely that. The housing market is going down because workers' real wages means wages indexed to inflation.
Yeah.
The real wages have not increased for years and years and years, whereas corporate profits have increased. So we have a crisis in the housing market. What we do is we give them cheap mortgages. And we give mortgages even though we know at some point they may not be able to repay. And that creates this sort of systemic cycle of crisis within capitalism that happens every 10 years, it seems. So we're still living with a crisis from 2008. The global economy has never really recovered from that. And before that, in 1997, there's the Asian financial crisis. Some of you may or may not remember. So loads of economies went under, people lost their jobs, etc. So this is where Marx comes in. Go, well, if you don't read Marx and you don't analyze capitalism in that sense, you will never understand why these crises keep repeating. Okay, so back to this here, this whole idea of alienation. The abolition of property is essential because obviously it allows people to reconnect to what we want to produce. Okay, what we think society needs. If we think society needs new handphones, a new iPhone model or a new Samsung Galaxy model every 6 months, then we can do that. But if you think we need to produce other things, we can decide that. Society can decide that. Okay, and we don't need to rely on advertising as such to convince everyone else that your old phone is actually now out of date.
So maybe the problem is with consumerism and not capitalism.
Well, consumerism and capitalism are
No.
intricately intertwined. Capitalism relies on consumerism. How else do you sell your products? But okay, I know this discussion this is really an entire course really. But can I just quickly move on so we can come to the assignment that we need to do, the first assignment for this course. Okay. I mentioned Marx identifies what is known as the dialectics and laws of motion in capitalism. Okay, how capitalism actually operates. I don't necessarily, you know what, I'm going to skip most of this because I think you can read some of this and if you've got questions you can ask me. I want to get on to this next slide here, his actual analysis of capitalism. Okay, so again, remember, that's the key thing which we always come back to explain why there's always Marx. He's a sociologist, he's a philosopher, historian, and a variety of other things, and yet everything seems to be rooted, grounded in the economy, and that's because of production. Okay, now the main social relation in capitalist society is capital. So for Marx, capital, what is capital? If I ask you a question, what is capital? What do you think capital is? It's usually money.
Could be
Yeah,
more than
it's money. Money to invest, to make money, to grow the money. But for Marx, capital is not money or a thing. Capital is actually a social relation. Okay, it's a relationship between the capitalists and workers. Now, there's certain preconditions for capital. Okay, for capital to emerge, capital and capitalist is, first of all, we need a concentration of ownership. You can't have everyone owning everything. You need to have a few people owning the means of production. And this is what we see in society today. Okay, A few corporations, few large corporations own the bulk of production. Second, we need free labor. I've mentioned this before. So labor needs to be free, not just free to work, but free from the ownership of means of production as well. So you cannot have these workers having their own little workshops selling little trinkets or things on the side. They can't be doing these things because you need a workforce that has to go to work. You can't have some worker going, you know what, I'm really tired of these long hours and these low wages. I'm going to go back to my own pottery workshop and I'm going to start selling bowls. Okay? So that doesn't work for capitalism. And Marx traces these preconditions for capital back to the historical appropriation of means of production. I talk about primitive accumulation. So you can see why this slide actually leads back to the primitive accumulation slide. So, sorry, this is quite a challenge for me here with two computers. So the transition to capitalism is related to the class struggles and the emergence of, in this case, capitalist farmers in England. Okay, and eventually capitalist industrialists, capitalist factory owners. Is that fairly straightforward? Now I'm going to skip this one because we really jumped to it, and I want to look at laws of motions of capitalism very quickly before we try to wrap up. So the essence of capital really is the production of commodities for the market, with profit as a sole purpose of production, not meeting needs. And this is a distinction between capitalists and feudal landlords. Feudal landlords don't have to produce for the market because they can have peasants producing for them, for their own needs. Why do they need the market? They don't need the market. They have more than enough to feed themselves, their families, and to go on holidays, etc. Profit here is from the exploitation of labor, as you've seen in the documentary. So the true value of the item is not what the, let me rephrase that. The capitalist makes the worker produce more than it takes for the worker to pay for the worker to sustain themselves. Okay, so the worker can produce, let's say, 5 tables a day or 5 chairs a day. Okay, but the capitalist is only paying for the worker for the value of 1 chair because the price of 1 chair is all the worker needs to reproduce themselves. What do we mean by reproducing themselves? Feed themselves, clothe themselves, go home, feed their family, etc., and come back to work the next day. You can't not pay the worker, obviously, because you need the worker to survive. You need the worker to be healthy and strong. Okay. What else? In capitalism, competition compels capitalists to innovate, reduce costs or increase profits. It's also antagonistic because it impoverishes other classes in the process. How? By keeping costs low. Constantly looking for, if Apple invests in Malaysia and Malaysia is not keeping wages, suddenly workers in Malaysia demand higher wages. What does Apple do? It relocates to Bangladesh, for example, where wages are lower. So it's antagonistic in that sense. And it's also crisis prone, and we talk about overproduction. Now, I just want to look at this thing with capitalism and the whole essence of what we're talking about. Why the conflict there? This is a shorter.
Marxism is a theory based on the ideas of the philosopher Karl Marx. Marx was born in Germany in 1818 and died in London in 1883. He's buried in Highgate Cemetery in North London. Marxism is what is known as a conflict theory because it states that society is in conflict with each other, and Marxism claims that this conflict is between the rich and the poor. Now, Marxism, as we understand it as sociologists, is a political and economic philosophy, a view of the way things are now, and suggestions as to where society is headed. The danger is that we start to view it based on what we understand about its relationship to communism and the politics and oppression of the old Soviet Union. Marx never saw communism in this way. He saw it as liberation and as a leveller, a way of creating a fairer society and of a way of getting the best out of all people, not just those with money and power. To really understand Marxism, we need to start with its opposite, capitalism. Capitalism represents the type of society you and I live in today. In Marx's terms, it's an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production. What this means is that our society today is based on a few people who own factories, businesses, shops and other corporations. These corporations aren't owned by the people who work for them, the employees, or jointly by the employees and the owners, but by the owners only. Marx was formulating his theories during the Industrial Revolution, a time when Britain and other countries were going through a very dramatic change. The old feudal system, when lords of the manor owned the land, meant that the ordinary people had freedom and rights to all land. It was held in common. When the government passed a number of enclosure acts in the 1700s and 1800s, ordinary people no longer had the right to live on this land, and many of them were forced to pack up and move to the towns and the cities, which were beginning to grow due to the increase in factories and textile mills. Whereas previously people were free to keep their own animals and grow their own crops on common land, once they reached the cities they had to find work in the factories, in the employment of the factory owners. The work was hard and often dangerous, and the pay was very poor. Many factory owners didn't want to pay high wages because this would mean less profit for them, so children were often used as cheap labour. The Industrial Revolution promoted a capitalist way of thinking, what we call a capitalist ideology, and also created two distinct groups of people. The factory owners, who were middle class, Marx called these the bourgeoisie, and the workers, or working class, Marx called these the proletariat. Marx was on the side of the proletariat because he saw them as being treated unfairly by the factory owners. Not only did Marx see them as being treated unfairly or being oppressed, he also saw the system as one that tried very hard to make sure that the poor stayed poor and the rich continued to get richer. So Marxism views capitalist society as being based on a system that encourages inequality, because the rich will always need someone to do the work they don't want to do. It's called a conflict theory because society is in conflict, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. However, Marx also suggested that at some point the working class would realise that they had the power to change things. Through education and personal development, some members of the proletariat would begin to understand the system better and devise ways of changing it. Marx believed that such radical change could only come about through revolution, when the workers rise up and overthrow those who were treating them unfairly. In place of capitalism, a new system would be established in which all people were treated equally and all the factories and businesses were owned by everyone. In other words, they were communally owned. Marx called this system communism.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about capitalism. Yeah, Mr. Green, capitalism just turns men into wool.
Okay, was that a bit clearer? Or was it the same?
Yeah.
It's a slightly different angle to the previous one. Okay. So, for Marx, economic development is the outcome of historically specific class struggles. Okay, so with capitalism emerging, it was a class struggle between the feudal classes and the emerging capitalist classes. Each transition has its own particular history of struggle, balance of forces, so we never really know whether a transition is going to happen or not. It depends what happens on the ground. Okay, and depends on whether a consciousness develops amongst a particular class of people. It depends on the context. It depends on ideology. Okay. So class is really just a key category and it's not the only category, okay, to study modernity in this case. It's simply a guide. Class is a guide to understanding society. Obviously, there's conflict in society that manifests in different ways: class, ethnicity, religion, along gender lines. Okay. Social theory here is Marx's critique of social theory is that it's often confined to trying to understand appearances, what happens on the surface, rather than what's actually happening underlying. Just because something manifests itself in terms of, say, a communal struggle between two different types of communities or two ethnic groups, doesn't necessarily mean that it is ethnic or even religious. Okay, and we need to understand what the underlying drivers are. And of course, for Marx, you need to understand what's happening in terms of, say, capitalism and the economy. So for the Marxist struggle is really a class struggle. For Marx, the class struggle is the operative principle for historical movements. Different classes struggle. The conditions for class struggle are brought upon by the specific modes of production and the contradictions and tensions and crises within the mode of production. So capitalism creates crisis, and we see huge numbers of social movements emerge. The anti-Wall Street movement, for example, you heard of this? Yeah. Various movements emerge, and whether these movements will be strong enough to bring about real change, of course, it depends on a variety of things. It depends on how powerful the media is in terms of perpetuating certain types of thinking. I think that's something we really need to think about. Everything we think we know about capitalism is often colored by how we've been presented, how capitalism has been presented to us. Okay, so for Marx, we need to look beyond that. That brings us to the issue of ideology, which has been raised already. Okay, so the dominant group controls how we think and how we, whether we think positively or negatively about certain things. So some things are explained as natural and proper. For example, no one questions where rich capitalist families that hand down who've managed to pass on wealth through the generations, how they got their wealth in the first place, and whether wealth should be inherited or wealth should be earned. And that's one of the big problems with capitalism today, is that if you're born in a rich family, then it's great. But if you're not, how can we talk? Can we talk about competition when someone has such a huge advantage? Okay, so someone from a poor family can never compete against someone from a rich family who gets dropped off at private school, who gets private tuition after school, who doesn't have to worry about looking for money to help the family at the end of the day, for example. Okay. I'm going to skip that thing about Hegel. So ideologies mean that we need to disentangle. For Marx, we need to really understand how ideology works and disentangle, make sense of what is actually happening and what we think is happening. Okay, I want to quickly move, because it's almost going to be an hour since our last break. I want to quickly move to the course assessment, which I think I put it on here. Okay, as you know, the course assessment, you got to write just 5 short papers throughout this course, not for every session. Okay, for 5 key sessions, which are basically the 5 key social theories: Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Gramsci, and Edward Said. Yeah, just 750 words. Technically, they're due 1 week after the session. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions made for students who are not here yet. The main task for you is really, the first bit is to show that you understand the piece of reading, the passage. Okay, so the first 500 words or the 750 words, the first 500 words you use just to summarize what you think the key issues are, the key points. And then the remaining 250 words, reflect on this critically, on the strengths and weaknesses of the reading, and also if you can, the relevance of it to contemporary context, to today, basically. Okay, and what we will sort out once the other students are here is, because there's going to be 10 or 11 of you, you probably be allocated 2 or 3 to 1 tutor. And what will happen is you meet after you submit this piece, reflective piece, you meet with your tutor, and that actual date is a bit flexible. It depends on the group and on the tutor. Okay, but usually it tends to happen the week after the session. So you submitted it, the tutor has at least half a day to grade it, and remember, it's just a pass-fail. It is pass-fail assignments, okay? And then you discuss it in pairs or in groups of 3 with your tutor. Important thing here, of course, is assessment criteria. So you need to be able to at least reasonably accurately convey what the essence of that reading is, and the main arguments forwarded, key concepts if needed. You need to respond in a fairly balanced and academic way to the reading, and of course, clear writing is important. Okay, now I put down there's 2 readings for Marx. One is Capital Volume 1 and one is Communist Manifesto. I don't really have any preference in terms of which one you should you can write on.
So we have to choose between Communist Manifesto and the other
You
readings.
can choose, or you can
Summarize both.
summarize both. I don't think you'll have enough
Word limit.
space to summarize both. So at this stage, before class, I was leaning towards Communist Manifesto, simply because it's a lot more famous in many ways. It's like the little red book, and it'd be interesting to you you may be able to engage it with it more. But if you want to do some, you want to do Capital, which is just 1 or 2 chapters, I think, and they're not that. They're colorful language. It's written in a particular era, where writing is much more emotionally charged in many ways. Okay, any questions in terms of the assignment?
Can we, go and then write the assignment and meet you or the tutor before we submit the assignment?
Yeah, of course. You're always free to discuss. In this case, because the first assignment is with me, you're free to meet me, make an appointment, come see me, or I'm normally in on Wednesdays to discuss. But what I wanted to do was basically end with this question, which basically what we started with. Okay, but now that we've done a whole tour of Marx or Marxism, hopefully we can now revisit this. We started with that. We can revisit this and perhaps think as a group how. I mean, he may be relevant, he may be irrelevant. Now it's up to you to make the argument. But what do you think now after that we've gone through the session and watched a few of the slides, looked at a few of the slides and a few of the clips? Do we think Marx is relevant to study Muslim cultures? Can we use him in this course, in this MA? And if so, how do you think? We touched on a few things already in terms of relevance before, in terms of same concerns with the Prophet, in terms of equity, equality, in terms of class antagonism. I'm not sure whether you feel the same way now. So come on. Any suggestions how you might use Marx, or how Marx might be applicable?
Why don't you share your perspective?
I could. If there's no one who
Sorry?
okay, I'll share what I'm doing right now. Okay, so one of my research areas is on Islamization. Okay, so and I'm Malaysian, so I do a lot of my research on Malaysia, although not necessarily exclusively on Malaysia. And one of the questions I've been asking is what has been driving Islamization in Malaysia, and with what implications does that have? And my approach to studying Islamization in Malaysia is not to try to look at the underlying drivers behind Islamization. And Islamization in Malaysia starts at the same time. The current wave of Islamization starts at the same time as in the rest of a lot of Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries. It starts in the late 70s and starts with a lot of students coming back from the Middle East. It starts with student groups being inspired by what's happening with the Iranian Revolution, for example. Students coming back from Al Azhar University, a lot of them. And the question I have is, why are these students now embracing? Because one of the things I study is social conflicts. So in Malaysia, the divisions, the conflict has often been along ethnic lines between Malays who are by law also Muslims. So you cannot be a Malay and a non-Muslim. It's illegal. So the divisions have been between ethnic Malays and non-Malays, usually ethnic Chinese who live in Malaysia. But that has slowly since changed over time. From the 80s and 90s, it's shifted towards Malay being a ethnicity being a division to religion, to Islam. And so this to me is an interesting shift. And I think I look at two things. I look at Marx's approach in terms of class and social relations, but I also look at what capitalism as a whole is happening, what's happening in the economy, and why is capitalism compelling different groups to take up different identities, in this case Islam. And my current research is looking at Islam as a form of patronage. Do we know what patronage is? So Islam provides jobs, Islam provides economic advantages to specific groups. So it makes sense to groups who, for a variety of reasons, cannot compete in a globalized economy. They push, they seek increasing positions in the Islamic bureaucracy. So one of the indicators of Islamization in Malaysia, for example, is the massive growth of this bureaucracy, of the Islamic bureaucracy, whether it's related to Sharia courts, whether it's related to halal certification. There's a massive bureaucracy in Malaysia which I'm in the process of documenting. Okay, and so to me there seems to be a gravy train. So Islam, in a sense, is really only a surface appearance. It's a means to an end. Okay, it's yes, it's not to say that some people are not increasingly more religious, but it's just to say that a lot of the manifestation of Islam in Malaysia has got to do with economic benefits. And economic benefits, in turn, can only be understood if we understand the dynamic of capitalism. Because a lot of these groups, and it's not just in Malaysia, can't compete globally against multinational corporations or against more efficient economies in Taiwan, for example. So that's one way to use a Marxist sort of methodology to understand conflict. So the manifestation of conflict in Malaysia is not along class lines, although actually it is very much a class thing, but it's just manifested in terms of religion. So the problem is, if we look at religion as a starting point, we may not get to the bottom of it. Okay, so that's one way to I think why Marx's method can be useful. Okay, because there's always underlying class conflict. But of course, going back to the whole idea of ideology, we rarely see class conflict reported. If we look at the Arab Spring in Egypt, for example, there has been a series of industrial actions, worker strikes, throughout the years leading up to the Arab Spring, but you never see this in the mainstream media. because it's not in the interest of, you could argue, Marxists would argue that it's not in the interest of the capitalist media to report on revolt and revolution against capitalism. Okay, so the picture we get of revolution and the Arab Spring is really about democracy, it's about corruption, it's about all these other things. But actually, there's been undergoing serious class-based tensions. Also because the Egyptian government under Mubarak wanted to privatize a lot of these state-owned factories. And we know under privatization, wages go down, workers lose their jobs because there's less guarantees. Okay, any other questions?
How long have you been researching on this?
Oh, Islamization, a couple of years. I'm a political economist by training, and I don't necessarily do religion. I do privatization, I do industrialization, and I do Malaysia, which is a Muslim country. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Any questions? Please email me. I think you should have my email.
Yeah,
I should have put it up, but you should be able to find it easily. And do those 2 readings if you haven't already. And any questions, let me know. And then you'll be allocated your tutors, hopefully by this week when the rest of the students will. Thank you.
So we have to submit this assignment next week.
I've created yes, I put a deadline tentatively for 1 week from today, but and you submit it by Moodle. Well, for my courses, we use Moodle. Okay, so you'll see I created a Moodle assignment page already with the questions and all the details there. So you just need to drag and drop your Word document in. Any issues, let me know, or you can talk to the IT people.